Okay, I think that was the recording. So welcome to using community mapping as a participatory research tool. Today I'll go through a few things, but firstly, I want to respectfully acknowledge that I stand on what always was and always will be Indigenous land. I acknowledge that it is stolen land and First Nations Australians and Torres Strait Islanders are the rightful custodians of all these lands and waterways. I unreservedly apologise for and express my shame over the dispossession, marginalisation and attempted genocide of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I thank the traditional custodians of this land for continuing allowing me to work, play, campaign and conduct our activities here. Right now, I am zooming in from Melbourne, which long before this colonial name was actually known as Birrarung, sitting on the curl of what we've called Port Phillip Bay, which for far longer has been known as Naarm. My name is Lana. I'm a social inclusion and participation specialist. I'm a researcher, facilitator, advisor, trainer, coach, and I'm the woman behind community-powered responses. You can find out more. You can find out about all sorts of things. You can read the blog, find out about trainings at www.communitypoweredresponses.com, or you can email me at hello@communitypoweredresponses.com. Today's objectives is to really unpack what is community mapping and how can it be used as a participatory research tool. And I'm going to share that information with you by really unpacking some examples of how I've used community mapping. I'm going to use examples from Indonesia and Fiji over 3 different projects. And so in a really kind of succinct way, participatory mapping or community mapping is the process of creating a tangible display of people and or places and or experiences that make up a community through community members themselves identifying them on a map. People use all different types of maps, and certainly because I work in a lot of rural and remote areas, I use butcher's paper and we draw the maps ourselves, and it's a really interesting process to get community members to draw their community on a map. Sometimes we have printed out maps and we've printed them out on paper, we've printed them out on that kind of material that's the same as banners and all sorts of things. We've bought maps that you fold out. And of course, there's a lot of specialized software to create maps online with geospatial abilities and so forth. I've not used those things. I know geographers use them. But there's a whole host of variety of ways that you can create maps that suit the purposes for you. In my work, and particularly my participatory work, part of the way that I work is using materials that the local community can easily access, because I want them to be able to replicate this. When the project's finished, maybe, we're doing it about water sanitation and they decide that actually after the project's finished, they want to work on access to public transport or access to health centres or all sorts of things, and they can continue to use the tools and the activities that we've done together. And so I always use materials that the community can resource and access themselves once I've gone, so that then they can replicate and use the materials for their own benefits again. So as I said, I'm going to share 3 examples of participatory mapping with you. One is on humanitarian and disaster risk reduction research in Suva, Fiji. One is on water sanitation and hygiene from a participatory action research project in Eastern Indonesia. And one is social protection research in Jakarta, Indonesia. And as I'm going on, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat so that you don't forget. And I will have questions at the end. So the first one is on humanitarian and disaster research in Suva, Fiji. And as you can see, there's a photo of me with people around. I've purposefully kind of trimmed the photo so nobody's faces are showing because I don't have their permission to show their faces here. But it is doing some community mapping in Suva. And that project, I guess the context of that project is actually DFAT funded via Oxfam Australia and Oxfam Fiji. And the research partnership was a partnership between EdgeEffect and Rainbow Pride Foundation, researching the experiences of people with diverse sexual orientations, gender identities, expressions, and sex characteristics in 3 areas in Fiji. And we're trying to find out information around what their experiences were before, during, and after Tropical Cyclone Winston. We did the community mapping in all 3 places, but I'm just going to talk about the example of Suva. That community mapping and the other types of methodologies we used culminated in the report. The reporting of the research became led down by the River report, which you can see a copy of in the corner there. The methodology that I used, because I was the lead researcher in this project, was we used community mapping. And as we were doing the community mapping, I used that also as an unstructured focus group. And so as we're focusing on the maps, asking questions, digging deeper, recording that information, that helped me to ask more questions and dig deeper, but also helped me with the unstructured one-on-one interviews and the Talanoa sessions. We also, once we gathered all that information and kind of put it together and collated that information, we did a sense-making workshop with Rainbow Pride Foundation to make sure that they also had the same opinion and made the same kind of sense of that data. And then we had a validation workshop with organisations that were a part of the disaster risk reduction humanitarian space in Fiji. How was this participatory? And I guess it was participatory because I was really using the local expertise of Diverso GS community, so the LGBT community, to identify the people, the places, and the experiences that are both positive and negative. And so I got to learn a lot of things that I wouldn't learn any other way. By drawing up the map, for example, I remember them focusing on particular streets and knowing particular streets better. And at this one part, I asked them, what is it about this area that's so interesting and important to you? And they said, well, before Cyclone Winston, that was where we did sex work. So this was only a small part of the larger group that was doing the community mapping. They talked about how after Cyclone Winston, because there was cash-based interventions, so people got cash to help them recover from Tropical Cyclone Winston, some people spent their cash on sex work. And so, in fact, the sex work industry was really flourishing after Tropical Cyclone Winston. But for them, on this particular street, there was a lot of street lamps. And so it was the safest place to be able to do sex work. And it was that kind of information around then being able to talk to them about, well, what does it mean to be able to earn money afterwards, and having a flourishing sex work trade through cash-based interventions. And they talked about how they didn't know how to get cash-based interventions themselves, for example. Perhaps they didn't have ID, or perhaps because some of them were transgender, they didn't have ID that matched their identity. They didn't have bank accounts, or they didn't even have mobile phones, which was way money was transferred in cash-based interventions. And so it was a way for them to be able to get the resources they needed to be able to recover from Cyclone Winston. Other kinds of stories they shared was about, in a particular geographical space they were living in, there was the option of 2 different shelters. And they might go to one shelter as opposed to another one, because most of the shelters are churches, because they're the strongest buildings in the communities, and they felt like they'd be more accepted at one place than another place, or that they would go further because that's where their friends were and they felt safer in a group of people. And so those were the kinds of experiences, or those were the kinds of place-based and experience-based information that we were able to gather through the people based on community mapping methodology. And so, and from that, then I was able to take that kind of unfocused group discussion in the community mapping process, and then use that to undertake one-on-one interviews. And you can see a photo there of me undertaking a one-on-one interview with one participant, and they have given permission for their photo to be shared, and that photo is in the report. And so that's how it was participatory. It was participatory because I was using the local expertise of the local community. It was participatory because I was working with Rainbow Pride Foundation and using snowball sampling. It was participatory because I was teaching Rainbow Pride Foundation how to use these kinds of activities and methodologies to further their work as a local LGBT CSO as well. And so what did I learn from this particular community mapping process? And I think what I learned from that is that people felt comfortable to engage with us, EduFect, in the first place because we were working in partnership with Rainbow Pride Foundation. Secondly, because we also, like EduFect is an LGBT identified organization. I no longer work with them, but I was one of the co-founders. And they were more comfortable to engage with us because they were focusing externally on a map and their local expertise. In the first place, it wasn't a one-on-one interview where I'm asking really deep questions and I'm looking at them and I'm writing it down. We're focusing on an external thing. We're focusing on a map, and I'm letting them lead with their expertise first, and setting it up in that way meant that they felt more comfortable then, but also in later iterations of the research project. I learned that there's so much information to be shared in participatory action research, in community mapping or participatory mapping, and that sometimes you need to think about what information is just really interesting or nice to have, and what information is really important for the research project. And I still sometimes, because participatory methodologies brings in so much research, I still constantly, that's an ongoing learning process for me. I guess in this particular project, what was really interesting was how people use physical space for personal safety strategies. And so it was really a good reminder that people, places, and experiences are very much intertwined. And I learned that their knowledge and support are accessed through informal networks rather than formal humanitarian and DRR systems. And I think that's really important for us to think about when we're working with marginalised communities, what knowledge and support are they accessing through informal networks, and what should be happening, and what can we learn from that? I think lastly, the experiences of informal mutual aid that is not available via the general community or DRI humanitarian service. So informal mutual aid, where people are providing what people need, not what people assume they need, which is what the system does, was a really, really interesting process, because people weren't saying, this is what you need, here it is. They were saying, this is what I need, who can help me with this? And it's very much, I guess, flipping the script around how we provide aid. The second example that I want to share is water sanitation in participatory action research in Eastern Indonesia. And this is one map from there. It's not the map from the particular story that I'm going to tell you, but it's a map from the project. And so the context of this particular story or this particular project is that it's funded through Water for Women. And this particular partnership was working with Plan International Australia and Yaya Plan Indonesia. So I was working very much alongside Indonesia staff in the local communities themselves. And it was over 5 years that I was working with them. And so it was a really long time. The community mapping happened within probably the first 6 months of the project. The project was about increasing the advocacy and rights of marginalised groups in Eastern Indonesia. And the research groups were, so there was 5 research groups focused in 2 different geographical locations, focusing on women and people with disabilities. This particular group that I'm going to share about are a group comprised of people who were deaf, hard of hearing, or had mobility differences. So they were a group very broadly that were people with disabilities of a variety of genders. There was 2 disability groups in that space. One was a group of people that were blind or had low vision, and they decided that they wanted to have their own group without people that weren't sight impaired or blind. This group was like, we don't care who joins us, anyone can join us. And so it happened to be made up of people who were deaf, hard of hearing, or had mobility differences or physical disabilities. And they decided in the process that they wanted to advocate for safe, accessible, and inclusive public toilets. And the reason they got to decide within the context of water sanitation what they wanted to work on. And because it was a part of the participatory action research context. And as a group, as a very broad group of people who have disabilities or physical or sensory or auditory differences, they realised that their local communities, which are often thought of in the context of their local urban villages, that their friendship group was primarily other people with disabilities. That was because they'd met them through school or disability services, and that because of the stigma and discrimination they experienced, most of their friendship group had a commonality of having a disability because they were accepting of each other amongst the stigma that they were experiencing. And because that group was made up of identities across different urban villages, they didn't necessarily have easy access, physical access to each other because they weren't in the same geographical location. They were broadly in the same larger town because they were urban villages, but they were in different villages. And so what they wanted to do was have accessible public toilets in the big parks in the middle of the urban centre. Because if they had accessible public toilets, that meant that they could go, they could spend a couple of hours there, they could see their friends, but without the accessible public toilets, they didn't have access to a place where they could see their friends, they could hang out, and therefore their friendship groups, their emotional support, their peer support became inaccessible. And so through public toilets, their friendship groups became accessible. So that was a really big kind of thing. Water, sanitation, and hygiene is really important for being able to access peer groups, psychosocial support, all sorts of things. The methodology that we used was participatory action research. And it was over 5 years. And in that, there was many participatory activities, depending upon what they wanted to use and how they wanted to use it. But community mapping was one really important piece of the puzzle. In this case, it was used in collaboration with Photo Voice. And I guess the reason is because I really wanted the community to take leadership, to be the leaders of this research, and that I and Yayasan Plan Indonesia be the support people supporting them. And so because they were the main researchers, we had to work with them in ways that the activities they used were relevant and accessible for people who didn't necessarily have a really good education or had very limited education. Maybe they finished primary school, maybe they went to high school. It was very different for different people depending upon their socioeconomic status, how accepting their parents were, how easy it was to access school. Most people couldn't access public schools, but they could access a disability school. And using Photo Voice was a way to, I guess, prove, having hard proof that other people like the local government would believe them. And so the group decided that they wanted to create an evaluation tool on accessible public toilets. And so they came up with this list of things that they thought were really important for accessibility that made toilets accessible. And together we made it into a very simple tick box, yes, no tool. And then with the community maps, and this is one of the examples where we actually printed the maps out on really big pieces of paper. They got to identify and think about, well, what does a public toilet mean to them? And where is it on the community map? And when I say what does public toilet mean to them, was because there was very few public toilets. There was a couple in very big main parks, not in every park that was there, not in shopping centres or things like that. There wasn't really shopping centres there. There was groups of shops along roads. And so there wasn't public toilets like there would be in Melbourne, Australia. But there were Lura's offices. So the Lura is the village head of the Kelurahan, which is the urban village. So these villages, you can't really tell when they start and when they stop. And it's a little bit like saying suburbs in this case. And so they identified what they considered public toilets on community maps, which are toilets that they felt like they could go to. They could knock on the office of the Lura, the village head, and say, can I use your toilet? That was acceptable. So they considered that a public toilet, for example. So they identified all of the ones on the maps, and then the community went and took photos of the toilets and assessed them with the tool. And as they came back together to each other, they shared the photos and the assessments, and then marked on the map which ones they felt like were accessible or not accessible and why. And then developing a priority of toilets in strategic geographical locations on the map, and thinking about, well, in which area, who do we advocate to? Who were the potentially geographical based allies on that map? And that's how we used community mapping in that way. So it was very much the community using it as a research tool. And so that was how it was participatory. It was used as citizen research tool along with vote of voice and other activities. The community identified the assets, in this case, public toilets on the map. They used it to ascertain priority geographical locations and used to help identify target audiences and allies. For example, the urban village leaders, CSOs, community leaders, things like that. And what I learned was, remembered was that it's a really practical tool for citizen research. I don't get the chance so often to do genuine participatory action research. It's more kind of, a real push to get it as participatory as possible. And I felt this was really good citizen research. It allows communities to take a strengths-based and place-based approach to community development. And so really working with what are the strengths of the group that I'm working with and how can we use those strengths to do community-driven development. Participatory mapping in this case led to discussions via the maps that reflect community assets and the barriers to accessing them. So thinking about it in a community asset kind of lens, which means that it's less about a marginalized group or a minority group and more about how can others, like we get the village leaders and so forth, to come on board and think about it as a community asset, and identified which resources were missing from the community. And I guess, it was a really good learning that the community can take ownership of the process and the project. We know that in theory, but it was really good to see it in action. My next example is social protection research in Jakarta, Indonesia. And this is a picture of some of our community mapping. As you can see, in this case, we bought the maps. What was really interesting about this project is that this was before the research actually started. In this case, what I was doing was training the local partners in the participatory methodologies we were using for the qualitative research component. So I hadn't started the research yet. I was over there talking them through what we wanted to do, how we wanted to do it, what the methodology was, how it was going to happen, trying to get their buy-in for it and I tried to get their buy-in by practicing it on them, showing them what it would be like, participating in the research. And that was a really interesting kind of different perspective, and I learned a lot from that process. So it was USAID funded. It was a social protection research in Indonesia in 3 locations, focusing on the diverse Soji community, so people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities and expressions. We were working alongside 2 local organisations, so these were our partners. One was a legal rights organisation, and one was an organisation that was made up of, had a membership of LGBTIQ plus member organisations. And yeah, we were actually training the local partners, the legal rights organisation and the LGBT organisation, in the participatory methodologies we were using for the qualitative research component. So in this case, I'd actually developed a community asset worksheet for people to fill out first, like what are the social protection assets in your community? And then from that worksheet, putting them on the map. And that was also recorded. It was like a large focus group, like the Fiji context. From there, we're doing one-on-one based story interviews based on the information raised in the large focus group and community mapping. The researcher that I was working alongside was employed by the partner organisation as my research partner, but there was also research support workers that were from small local LGBT organisations. And I think in many cases, organisation is probably, it was technically or less an organisation and more of a network or a group of LGBT people in different places that we were working. And so with this was before the research actually started, and I was spending a week with the partner organisations and taking a learn through doing process. So really showing them what I was planning on doing, teaching the co-researcher and getting their buy-in by taking them through the process. And we, in this case, rather than asking them what social protection mechanisms there are in their community, because we were in Jakarta, I asked them what LGBT organisations there were in the community, because I thought that was something really easy, something that they would know, and also for them to start thinking that LGBT organisations are an informal social protection asset. What was really interesting about this, actually, I think that was in the learning. So I'll go on to how it was participatory. And it was participatory because it was used in this process to gain approval and sign off by doing teaching and practicing the methodology that we wanted. And in the broader community, it worked really, really well for the same reasons that it worked well in Fiji. It was participatory because it was teaching the local team members how to do community mapping as a research method, using the experience in the room about local assets, in this case, LGBT organisations as social protection assets. And the research as a whole, outside of this training component, was co-facilitated by local diverse SOGS researchers, support workers. What I learned, and what was really interesting, because the local activists that I was working with didn't know this either, is that the LGBTIQ plus organisations in Jakarta don't really do service provision work. They mostly do human rights advocacy work. And so they're not really connecting in with local community members. They're only really connecting in with a small cohort of people that also consider themselves activists. And that was really interesting because even, you know, in the other places where we were doing the research, many of them didn't know about how LGBT organisations could help them or what support they could get from them, because they only know that LGBT organisations as this group of activists that advocate up to the top, not work down to the ground. What I learned is that it's essential to upskill and mentor local workers, community-based workers, and that we can't make assumptions about the research, including community mapping, you know, because it is a great research tool. But if we go in and make assumptions about what social protection is or what safety is, or, you know, even in Fiji, for example, will people go to shelters? You know, chances are we can't make those assumptions that they will, and we learn extraordinary amounts of information through the community mapping process. So I wonder if there is any questions.
I have a question if no one else has one.
Yeah, go ahead.
With your initial questioning,
yeah,
you're keeping it quite general, if I understand correctly. Like you're not saying, what is a social protection asset near you? You're saying, are you aware of an organisation, for instance?
Okay, that's a really great question. And what I tend to do at the beginning of all research projects is I have meetings in the community and just invite community to come along to tell them who I am and what I'm doing. And so in this case, we held like a 2-hour workshop in Jakarta, like in the social protection one, for example, again, it was snowball sampling. So the local community workers, the local LGBT people would go out into their communities and say, this is what we're doing, come along. And we would have these workshops, but we'd spend 2 hours explaining what we're doing, and we would explain, you know, this is what social protection is. You know, these are the things that we're looking for. In the case of this one, actually, we're looking at the formal social protection system. And it could be a health service, it could be this, it could be that. And it would be a very kind of, we'll try and make it as fun and interactive as possible so that they can ask us questions and they can learn as well. And so we would explain what is social protection, or what is humanitarian assistance, or what is water sanitation and hygiene. With the water sanitation and hygiene, I even made cards up and, you know, would have fun. Like, is this card of this person, you know, next to this toilet? Is that water? Is that sanitation? Is that hygiene? So we would do other activities as well so that they could understand the language we were using, like social protection or WASH, and what it meant and what we were looking for first. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that does. That makes sense. So you're being quite upfront about the questioning. You're not keeping the topic a secret. It's not.
No.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, I have to say though that it's always a really close balance between being really upfront and being really honest and saying this is what it's about, but also not giving them the answers that they think we might want to hear.
Yes.
And that's a really tricky space. Like with social protection, for example, you know, we would start things, we would kind of ask these questions like, well, how do you get money? Or what do you do when you're sick? You know, so I won't say what health services do you go to, what, you know, because I would try and word it in a way in which wouldn't give them answers that I was looking for. I didn't want them to say, well, I go to this health service, I, you know, access this, you know, benefits or social insurance. It's, what do you do to get money, or what do you do when you're sick? And I would ask those kinds of questions. So then they were answering me in their words with their social protection mechanisms, whether formal or informal.
That makes so much sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right. Okay. So I just want to alert you to some workshops that are coming up. I don't know where in the world you are. I'm currently in Melbourne, although I do work all over the place in Australia and globally. But I have a photo voice workshop coming up on Saturday, the 24th of February. And as I'd mentioned, I use photo voice really closely with community mapping. So that might be of interest. I have a community mapping workshop on Saturday, the 13th of April, a story circle workshop on Saturday, the 22nd of June, and a body mapping workshop on the 21st of September. I also have a 5-day participatory action research course that's on from Monday the 29th of April to Friday the 3rd of May. So that's for 5 whole days. And that one goes through the whole project cycle. And that's it. So I want to thank you for coming along, coming to this webinar. And we do have one free webinar each month. So have a look on www.communitypoweredresponses.com for our next month's workshop. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.